Alright guys, Vilem here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm finally back with another spoiler review for a recently released game, that game being Final Fantasy XVI. Which, by the time this video is coming out, it'll be almost a month after this game's release, largely because of how long it took me to finish this game. However, it is a game that I did largely enjoy. I know it is a very divisive game out there, particularly amongst the Final Fantasy fandom, and I can fully understand why. However, I do feel like this game does a lot of what I personally want in the modern day. It is a cinematic, narrative-focused experience with solid action RPG gameplay throughout, though I can understand the complaints of people upset at how watered down the game is, particularly in comparison to previous Final Fantasy games, and I understand people's complaints about the narrative at points, which we'll later talk about. However, I just feel like it's a game that kind of fits exactly what I want from a game nowadays. So again, I still want to obviously talk about this game more in depth. Now, obviously, as with this being a spoiler review, I'll obviously be running through the narrative and my thoughts on it later in the video, though I do want to talk about some general aspects of the game first. First, I'm talking about this debate on, is Final Fantasy XVI a Final Fantasy game, which again seems to be a pretty divisive topic, where it does feel like a lot of people are very upset at how this game lacks a lot of what was previous staples in a Final Fantasy game, where there's no party system, you cannot play as any character outside of Clive, outside these really basic Torgal commands. You have this really watered down customization system, along with action combat that very much feels like Devil May Cry, and I can fully understand why the Final Fantasy fanbase, people that are accustomed to the original turn-based games, can find this game very much lacking. However, I do feel like from a narrative perspective, it is very Final Fantasy. While you could definitely tell the inspirations from Game of Thrones, I do feel like largely narratively, there is still a lot of connective tissue that makes great use of Final Fantasy lore, making summons into these icons, using crystals in an interesting way, making them the source of conflict in the story. And I do feel like from that sense, it's still a Final Fantasy game, though I can understand how people don't look at it that way. And even then, some of these complaints about it, I don't personally feel. Now, watered down customization, 100%. I do think the customization system in this game is very much lacking. I think the upgrade system and crafting systems are just pretty mundane, with it feeling like it really doesn't end up changing much. However, I will say for the party system, I kind of actually like that there is no party system for this one game, for the most part. I will say, I think there's one particular character that we'll talk about that I think would have benefited from being playable, though outside of that, I kind of like that this is a game so focused on the character of Clive. I think Clive, this sympathetic, complex character that goes through this really interesting arc, that the fact that this game is entirely revolved around him, I think does boon this game as a whole. Now again, as a Final Fantasy game, I can understand that people are upset that the other side characters don't get that much of a focus, so I do think for what this game is trying to be, and this again, this focused narrative on the story of Clive, I do feel like it works for this one specific game. Now again, if this were to be the norm for Final Fantasy moving forward, if Final Fantasy XVII were to not have this approach to storytelling and just simply have no party system for the sake of it, I do think that would be an issue. But I do think for this one specific game, again, in a series like Final Fantasy, which is constantly shifting from entry to entry, I don't think it's entirely bad that this one game has done this. And obviously, again, there's the criticism that the combat is too much like Devil May Cry, too action-y, which, again, I don't really have that complaint either. And I do find the combat system overall really fun. I do like the icon abilities and being able to respect them at will. I do like being able to test out all the different abilities and being able to play to your style, and I do really enjoy that system. I do also like the accessibility options in this game, where, I mean, there isn't that big of a range of difficulty settings in this game. However, they do give you these accessories that very much benefit your experience. Now, really, the only one I ended up using long-term was the timely dodge one, which brings up this quick time event at a time that you can dodge, which I actually kind of liked having that in the game. To me, it made it feel a lot more cinematic of an experience. And again, if you don't like it, you could just simply not use it. Now, I will say outside that, the game still is relatively easy. I feel like the only times I ever died in this game are from really ridiculous attacks that end up killing me despite having most of my health left. Or outside of that, this game is pretty easy, and I get people's criticisms with that, though again, it's something that I don't personally mind. Now, along with that, I should mention that yes, there are a couple presentation hiccups with this game. I mean, frame rate on performance mode is pretty jittery to where, while it doesn't commonly drop below 30. You definitely do notice drops here and there that just make it come off as a bit unstable, along the fact that there's a pretty jarring shift between graphics in this game, where a lot of the more story-focused cutscenes are some of the best cutscenes I've ever seen in any game. However, we transition from that to some of the cutscenes in side content, which largely come off as mundane. And again, it is a very jarring shift there that really isn't a major issue, though it is something very noticeable, especially when you see these very high-quality cutscenes otherwise. I should mention that this game is structured pretty linearly. Like, it does have open areas that you can explore, though isn't really this full open world, which again is another criticism I can fully understand, especially considering the fact that the game doesn't really open up until around 10 hours into the overall game, which for you to spend that long simply just running down a straight line, I understand that that can be a criticism for most people. But again, for me, I am looking for a more narrative-focused experience. I do feel like that fully plays into that. Also, I want to mention side missions in this game, which is another point that people use to criticize the game. And this is another point that for me, it's not really a major issue. I do feel like early on, these side missions that people call boring are simply not that bad. I mean, a lot of the missions are like 2 minutes. Like, while the tasks within them are kind of tedious, they're also so short that I wasn't really bothered by them, along with the fact that I do think they do a lot for the world building of the game, showing the people that Clive is fighting to save, making us more attached to this world, which I do think the world building of this game is really incredible. I do feel like the side quests definitely add to that. How people are talking about how these aren't side quests to the quality of The Witcher 3. Yeah, I do feel like a lot of the endgame side quests are of that quality, where there are some really great final side quests in this game that really do wrap up a lot of the character arcs in a really satisfying way. So again, just in general, I do think the side missions in this game are pretty solid. Though something about navigation that does really irk me is the fact that there's for some reason no run button, which is strange in a game that has you running down linear paths constantly. You would think there would just simply be a run button instead of you having to press forward and like 30 seconds later you'll finally start the run, which all felt very arbitrary. Instead, we have a jump button that doesn't really do anything, which just feels weird. Though to help out with that, eventually you are able to get a chocobo through a side mission, though even that is like a decent ways into the game, and really it's just, I don't get why they just didn't add in a run button. By the way, that's most of the gameplay stuff I wanted to talk about. Now let's talk about the narrative, which ends up being a return to the medieval setting, one feeling very reminiscent of the very early Final Fantasy games. And again, you can very much tell the inspirations from Game of Thrones, not just in the fact that it is this really dense world that has these multiple factions all fighting for conquest, but also the fact that there's little characters here that do feel very Game of Thronesy. I mean, Clive very much parallels Jon Snow. You have Annabella who very much parallels Cersei. You have Ultima paralleling the Night King. It's like there are very big parallels even in that light. But I do feel like, again, there is still that Final Fantasy connection there through lore bits and some really over-the-top action that feels very Dragon Ball Z that definitely makes it more distinct from Game of Thrones. And again, I really just love how dense this world is. I mean, the fact that they add in the active time lore mechanic, a mechanic that allows you to at any point read data entries about what's happening in the current scene, is pretty insane. And definitely a mechanic I would like to see in games moving forward. But with that, I do want to start running through the narrative from beginning to end, which obviously the prologue of this game was released as a demo, which really caused a lot of hype for this game, and rightfully so. I actually ended up replaying this portion of the game right before recording this video, and it is a really insane start. I mean, starting off right away with the first icon fight in the game where you play as the Phoenix as it's being chased by Ifrit, which really just overall, the icon fights in this game are just insane. Some of the biggest spectacles I've ever seen in any game. Again, very much feeling influenced by Dragon Ball and the choreography of it all, and to have this as the start of the game is pretty insane. Though we then cut to Clive in the modern day, giving us this incredible set piece as we're navigating through this battlefield with Titan and Shiva fighting in the background, all also getting this opening scene of a council meeting that involves the characters of Benedicta and Hugo that really introduces the more political aspects of the story very well. Though after getting knocked out, we do get a flashback sequence that really gives us this great backstory on Clive, meeting these characters like Joshua and Jill, who strangely the young versions of them are betrayed by Amicia and Hugo from A Plague Tale, which is just bizarre. We get some incredible scenes with them alongside meeting his parents and Annabella and Elwyn, who come off in very different ways there. But all this really is a great setup to Clive being this black sheep due to Joshua being chosen as the dominant of the Phoenix, and we get all this great setup to Clive's promise to protect Joshua, only for obviously all this to go wrong, where they're ambushed by Sambrecht soldiers, where Elwyn, their father, is killed, which ends up awakening the Phoenix, who is later killed by Ifrit, who is very clearly Clive, though for some reason the game seems to not want you to know that right away, which I find that aspect of this game kind of strange. And this happens multiple times across this story to where it feels like something's pretty obvious. However, it feels like the game is not wanting you to know that and tries to make it a reveal later on the story, even though it's like kind of obvious that you should know this. Though Clive's portrayal here as Joshua is being killed by Ifrit is really gut-wrenching. Just the screams from Clive in this moment are really powerful. I mean, Ben Starr plays Clive, and he really does an incredible performance. And I will say, at first, I was a bit underwhelmed by his performance. I did feel like at first it kind of just felt like he was being this generic, gruff Final Fantasy character. Though I feel like as time went on and the character starts to open up, you really do see these different shades of his character. It really makes Clive one of my favorite Final Fantasy protagonists at this point. But anyway, the section does end with the reveal that Annabella was in on all this, though she has betrayed Rosaria to the Sambrechts to preserve her bloodline, which feels strange. And I will say, overall, Annabella does come off as probably the most despicable villain in this game, one that does despicable things for her own selfish desires. And while this reveal here is a pretty big one, I do feel like Annabella's overall storyline does come off a bit tropey to me. I wish there was a little bit more depth to it outside of her just wanting to preserve her bloodline and her just being a terrible person. But this does lead to Clive being imprisoned by the Sambrecht army, which is where we see him 13 years later as we cut back to the present day, where he's being sent to assassinate Shiva's dominant, who turns out to be also an enslaved Jill, to which we have a boss battle with her to free her, which is kind of strange looking back on it now, considering their relationship afterwards. But this all leads up to them being rescued by Sid, who is played by Ralph Inson, who has such a distinctive voice. And Sid ends up being a really likable character across this game. While, spoiler, he's not in it for that much, I do think he's a great mentor figure for Clive that really ends up setting him on his arc that he goes through across this game. But with that, we are taken to the hideaway, which I really like this aspect of this game, the fact that you do have this hideout that you can explore, talk to NPCs, these characters that, while they don't do much in the grand narrative, you do get to know them pretty well. Characters like Blackthorn, Goots, Karen, even Gav, and all this just makes this feel like an even more living and breathing world. But following this video of Sid agreeing to help Clive search for Ifrit's dominant, making it very clear that Clive is not aware that he is Ifrit at this point, to which we first end up traveling with him to Northwind, which feels like a section that's simply there to be a tutorial. That all leads up to us having another mission following this, at least us fighting Benedicta, which I will say, just in general, this game does have a very formulaic game design that I did kind of notice while playing the game. This kind of 2 mission setup of the first mission of that kind of being a more monotonous mission of essentially you just traveling from one location to the other, but along the way you have to do some tedious tasks or have some combat sections, while the other one is a lot more story focused and ends up usually leading to you having a boss battle at the end. And it feels like this is kind of a structure that's utilized over and over and over again in this game, where it did feel very noticeable by the end of it. By the way, finding Benedicta does lead to the first true icon fight here with her unleashing Garuda, which is where Clive ends up turning into Ifrit once again, with this being this reveal to Clive that he was obviously the one that killed Joshua. This also has Clive absorbing Garuda's powers from Benedicta, obviously being the first of these icon abilities that we end up obtaining, and being this reveal that obviously we'll continuously get these moving forward, which starts to add a lot more variety to the gameplay. But following this, we do have Sid imprisoning Clive nude for some reason, until Sid's able to encourage him to continue searching for the truth, to which we end up getting our reunion with Jill and end up traveling back to Rosaria to find it occupied and drained from its mother crystal. And again, following the standard formula that I mentioned earlier, you do end up meeting Martha, a new side character that you later can come back to for more side quests, and do some pretty tedious tasks here to all lead up to a more important mission once you reach the Phoenix Gate ruins, where Clive ends up having to fight himself and accept the truth, which always ends up being this big moment for Clive, though again, kind of tropey in itself. But this does have him finally deciding to help Sid destroy the mother crystals to restore the world and free the bearers who are mistreated across the world, which ends up being these really satisfying motivations for Clive to be striving for moving forward. But also again adds another formulaic aspect of this game, the fact that each of the kingdoms that are part of this greater conflict end up having a mother crystal, which allows for these arcs of us encountering all of these kingdoms along the way, way to destroy their mother crystals, which again on paper is very tropey, but I really actually kind of like how this overall game is structured. And that allows you to explore all these different aspects of this world, which really ends up heightening a lot of the world building of it. All of this starts by us traveling to the Sambrek capital, destroy their mother crystal, which has us again meeting the Dame for more mundane content, though eventually we get the next icon fight of Clive fighting off against Typhon, which this is the first icon fight that really ends up upping the scale to an umpteenth degree, where despite us knowing that Ifrit in himself is already this massive creature, we end up fighting a creature that is even larger than him, which leads to some pretty insane moments. And I should also mention that the overall music during these sequences is pretty incredible as well. Really, the music throughout the entire game is great, though really the icon battle theme is something that really ends up sticking to my mind. But following this fight, we do end up having the first appearance of Ultima, who ends up being the final antagonist of this game, to where he ends up trying to take Clive as a vessel here, only for Cid to strike him down. However, Cid ends up being mortally wounded, being this great death scene for Cid, with him essentially passing on his legacy to Clive, giving Clive his powers, but also essentially giving Clive his dream, with Clive now being the one that has to fulfill this dream that they had, which I think is another great aspect of this game's narrative. But it's also here where it is revealed that Joshua is still alive, which, I'm too fair, technically was revealed earlier, though it's not confirmed until now, which again is another one of these aspects of the game, very much implying one thing, but trying to make it a reveal later on despite that. But here we do have Joshua absorbing Ultima to stop him from taking over Clive's body, which ends up stopping him for now, which is kind of a lackluster ending to that conflict. Though I will say, looking back on it, it is kind of surprising that they introduced Ultima this early on, where it does feel like people complain also about the back third of this game being so Ultima focused, saying it comes out of nowhere, when it's like, it's kind of set up extremely early on here. Now, I will understand people's criticisms with it not being as interesting of a storyline as what the story had been before that. The Ultima is really this integral character to the overall story, really controlling everything that really happens here, having control over Barnabas and taking form of Annabella's new son, and through that ends up manipulating a lot of the events that end up happening here, manipulating Hugo into thinking Cid is the one responsible for Benedicta's death and creating this vendetta between the two, which also leads to the destruction of the hideout, which ends this portion of the game, which is something that feels like this big moment when it happens, but then when we cut the 5 years later, nothing really seemed to change from that. It seemed like most people that were there survived anyway, but with that, as you mentioned, yes, we do cut forward 5 years later, which is pretty insane to me. Like, I was really caught off guard by the fact that we were shifting time periods this early on in the game, where typically in Final Fantasy, yeah, there will be this time skip pretty late into the game, probably in the back third, but the first that happened in the first third of the game was pretty jarring. But here we do see that Clive now uses the title of Cid, though I will also say, it does feel kind of weird that despite this being 5 years later, not much seemed to really change in that 5 years, where despite them being on this hunt to destroy all the mother crystals and them having destroyed one 5 years ago, they don't end up destroying another one for 5 years and then destroying the remainder of them all within a short period of time after that, which feels a bit weird. But either way, we do get to the new hideout. That's an even more expansive one, being built on top of this vessel. That's a pretty cool aesthetic, though. Following this, I do feel like the story kind of meanders for a bit, and really I feel like that's kind of one of the bigger criticisms of this game for me, is the fact that I do feel like from this point forward, it does feel like we're doing a lot of things that aren't as important to the grander story. It does feel like there are a decent amount of quests that simply just seem to be there for gameplay's sake, though we do end up having some reunions with some characters like Wade, who is in the prologue, and we end up meeting up with Byron, Clive's uncle, who ends up being a really fun character in this game, and their reunion's a really touching moment. Though eventually we do end up setting out to finally destroy another mother crystal, this one being in the Iron Kingdom, the kingdom that was imprisoning Jill, leading to this being a very Jill-focused section of the game, with her being able to confront her past. And this is probably the peak of Jill's character here, which is a shame because I really like Jill. However, I do feel like there is a pretty big disconnect with her. One, the fact that I feel like this section would have been so much more impactful if we were able to play as Jill. I feel like this is the one instance where I do wish there was some sort of party system for Jill in particular. However, even beyond that, I do feel like she's simply just not that important to the story beyond this, outside of her connection to Clive, where she simply feels like she's there to be this love interest for Clive, with her character not really getting much to do after this sequence. But following this, we do end up having our first fight with Hugo, to which we do end up defeating him, only for us to just not kill him for some reason, instead just take his powers, which feels dumb, especially considering the fact we have to fight him again. Though following this, we end up going to take down the Dhalmekian Mother Crystal, which has us traveling with Byron through the desert, only for Byron to not even stick with us the entire way there, which is just kind of weird. And even beyond that, we also meet a lot of characters along the way that don't matter. But the second fight with Hugo ends up being a pretty insane one that is on this ridiculous scale to where I don't even think it's matched beyond this in the game, where Titan's overall size is just insane. Like, it very much feels very in line with these fights from God of War 3 that were technical marvels at the time, and this really just ups that in a ridiculous way, where, again, from a technical standpoint, I feel like this is probably the most impressive feat that we end up seeing. Though with that, Hugo ends up finally dying there, leading to the narrative slowing down once again, with us having to spend some time doing tasks for Mid, Sid's daughter, who appears out of nowhere and is really just weirdly added to the story. And straight up, these missions are largely boring, though they end up having us spend time with our companions, which is pretty nice in that light. But I do feel like the pace really just slows down to a crawl at this point, where again, we continue to just meet more characters along the way to Dominion's other crystal that just don't matter. But once we get there, we do get another really incredible set piece that really feels like this final hurrah for the more political aspects of the story, feeling like this massive point where the story shifts to being more in line with the older Final Fantasy games. But here we do see Annabella having manipulated the Emperor of Sembrek to make their son the next emperor over his firstborn son in Dion, leading to Dion working with Joshua to start a coup against Annabella, which has him accidentally killing his father, which ends up putting him in Ultima's control, leading to his big icon fight against Bahamut. That ends up being another really insane set piece that has Ifrit working alongside Phoenix, and culminates in them literally fighting in the middle of space, which is really insane. But this ends up culminating in the reunion between Clive and Joshua being this great moment there, along with Dion ending up killing his half-brother, who is implied to have been Ultima all along, though I don't really fully understand how that works. But this ends up culminating in Annabella killing herself with nothing left to live for, which I will say I was really underwhelmed with the way that Annabella goes out here. Not that it doesn't feel in line with her character, 100% does. Again, she is this very narcissistic figure that only cares about the continuation of her bloodline, and with everything being taken from her here, it makes sense that she would go and off herself. But I do feel like just in general, I wish that there was a bit more satisfying of a conclusion to her arc, and that does tie in more so to Clive and Joshua, where I did feel like her death here just kind of felt a bit unearned to me. But with that, really the only main antagonists left in the game at this point end up being Barnabas and Ultima, with the reveal here that Barnabas is actually a lackey for Ultima, which the conflict against these two really end up taking the last third of this game, which is this point where I've heard people really go down on this game's narrative, and to be fair, I can understand it. I personally still really enjoyed this section of the game. I think this game has some really great moments, and I can really just buy into these more Final Fantasy style aspects of the story, though I can understand how this can be this jarring shift for people, where again the first 2/3 is so focused on these political Game of Thrones-esque aspects of the story, and for those to kind of be thrown away in the back third in favor of a god that is wanting to take over the world is definitely a jarring shift there. And I don't think it's really helped by the fact that both Barnabas and Ultima are not particularly interesting villains. I mean, they do just very much come off as these generic godlike figures that don't have that much depth to them. And I think Barnabas is also just kind of drawn out as a villain here, with us literally having to fight him 3 times in this game. But anyway, following this, we do get some pretty boring main missions of us having to check up on all of our allies. And we do get this pretty lengthy lead up to our first confrontation with Barnabas, with us heading towards the Free Cities and us having to pass through a couple villages and thankfully get to meet more characters. But once we get there, we do get this boss battle against Barnabas's knight Sleipnir, who is there. Like, to be fair, he was part of manipulation of Hugo earlier on, but is also just not that interesting of a character to me. But once defeating him, we then have Clive fighting against Barnabas, to which he is knocked away with 1 hit, which is a pretty insane moment there. And through they end up having Jill get captured here, to where now we have the very plan to obviously save her, which has us doing more fetch quests to fix up Mid's ship, which we're going to use to chase down Barnabas, which is just, again, kind of tedious, but eventually we end up catching up to Barnabas' ship and rescue Jill, and have this pretty epic boss battle with Barnabas as he parts the sea, and we battle in the middle of it, which is a pretty insane fight, though Clive ends up being bested by the end of it once again, which I feel like this is the one that I criticize a bit more in terms of their overall pacing of the story, where I do feel like this could have just easily been the point where we killed Barnabas and had just Ultima be the main antagonist from this point forward, instead of us being beaten again and having to go and track him down once again afterwards. But this does lead to this really great scene between Clive and Jill as they're randomly just nude around a campfire on the beach, which is implied to be the first time they ever hook up, which is just weird to me, considering it's like, how have they not in the last 5 years? Though from this point forward, they are portrayed as obviously very much in love. Kind of an interesting shift for Final Fantasy, where while I haven't played every Final Fantasy at this point, I feel like you very rarely see open displays of affection between characters, and I did kind of like that aspect of the Jill and Clive relationship here. Though the scene does culminate with Jill giving Clive her powers, and finally we end up having to travel to Barnabas' homeland, where this time we travel alongside Gav and end up rescuing a pregnant woman that seems to only be there just so she can give birth in the final scene, just to be this added aspect of symbolism there. But finally we have the final boss battle with Barnabas, which I will say I did find largely underwhelming. Now again, it is a pretty epic fight that has them going in and out of their icon forms, but I do find it kind of underwhelming that we never actually get proper gameplay in those icon forms. And really again, I just feel like the fight where they parted the sea would have been a lot more interesting of a final battle than in this personally, but again, still finally defeat Barnabas, leaving Ultima as the only remaining antagonist, where now we have Clive traveling alongside Joshua as we head towards the capital, with all this feeling like this is the end of the game. This feels like this lead up to the final battle, with all of our allies showing up as they open the path to us getting to Ultima. And once we get to Ultima, he ends up giving us a whole bunch of exposition about him being a god and how he created humanity, the breed of mythos, to serve as a vessel for his power, which again just all comes off very tropey. And while I didn't find Ultima that interesting of an antagonist, I do kind of like what he represents thematically. I like these parallels of how Ultima sees humanity and how humanity sees bearers. I do like this constant theme of prejudice and slavery and these struggles to free yourselves from that. That makes Ultima feel like a pretty satisfying villain thematically, at least. But here we do end up having a boss battle of Ultima that, again, I very much felt like this was going to be the final fight of the game. I was expecting it to intensify as time went on, only for it to not be that. And instead we get a dream sequence following it that has Joshua rescuing Clive from it, which just felt kind of pointless. And here we have Ultima rising the final Mother Crystal, which makes it clear that, oh, there's probably more to the game then. But it's funny that we do have Dion agreeing to help Clive and Joshua fly to Ultima's fortress in the sky that ends up obviously being the final mission. But first, we do get a billion side quests before that actually end up being pretty solid ones. A lot of them being these great farewells to pretty much every single other character in the game. We get to learn more about Dion through these, which by the end of it, I do think Dion ends up being one of the best characters in this game, having this really satisfying arc of redemption for him. We have this mission with Joshua that has them visiting their father's grave, being this great full circle moment. We have a mission with Torgal that has us finding Clive's childhood hideout and revealing that Torgal had been finding and saving mementos of Clive during the time they were separated, which is a really touching moment there. And we also get a final mission with Jill, which ends up being this really great payoff to their romance of Clive finding a grove of her favorite flowers and taking her there, which ends up again being a nice moment between the two. But finally we get to the final mission where we do get this final farewell to every character we've met across the game, which is funny that they're all at the hideout at once, which also makes you question, like, why didn't anyone else go outside of Dion and Joshua? Like, obviously it's explained by, oh, we need to fly there and how dangerous it could be. Still, it is just kind of funny that it's only Dion, Joshua, and Clive that go. And really, I will say this is the first point in the game where I started to finally think that Clive was going to die at the end, where Clive ends up appointing Gav as the new leader and declares his love for Jill. And really, to me, I never once thought through this game that Clive was going to die at the end. I very much felt like this was a game that was being set up to a more happy ending. This ending of Clive being able to live in this world that he had strived for, and I feel like for it to not lead to that ends up being a bit disappointing, but obviously we'll talk about it. But obviously we get to the ending section of the game, which we get this icon fight with Bahamut, Ifrit, and Phoenix fighting against Ultima, which ends up being mostly just quick time events, but eventually Dion ends up getting shot down, where he's obviously implied to be dead, though I won't be shocked if they end up having a DLC with him later down the road. And here we have Clive and Joshua stumbling their way to the Mother Crystal. In this final bit of gameplay before the final boss battle, which felt very much in line with the ending of Mass Effect 3 to me. But here we have them finally confronting Ultima, to where Ultima finally becomes whole by removing his fragment that Joshua had absorbed earlier, which ends up mortally wounding Joshua here, to where we get this really emotional moment here as Joshua ends up sacrificing himself to give Clive his icon, being this moment where Clive has finally become the Phoenix, this thing he was expected to be from birth, this thing that caused him to be this black sheep of his family, and this really great full circle moment there. And all this ends up leading to this final boss battle with Ultima, the first phase of it kind of just being this standard fight, but then it transitions to an icon battle and culminates in the more cliched final fight of Clive using all of his icon powers against Ultima, with the voices of his allies cheering him on, which felt very shonen-y. But again, a pretty satisfying final battle here, though strangely one that does end with him just doing this final punch on Ultima, which felt weird that was the way that you're going to defeat a god. But either way, Clive ends up absorbing Ultima's powers here, and we get a final farewell to Joshua, with us getting shots of their early life, which I will say, to me, while this is supposed to come off as this really emotional moment, I did feel like it came off a bit over the top to me. It's just clearly being this bait for you to get really emotional here, especially this moment where Clive sees Joshua for the first time as a child. But this takes us to the very end of the game, the final scene of the game, which ends up being this very ambiguous ending. One that, again, I was kind of underwhelmed that this was the ending we got. I very much wanted a more happy-go-lucky ending. And while we didn't get an all-out bad ending for these characters, we kind of got this weird in-between, with a lot of things not being fully told to us, a lot of things being left up for interpretation, which I don't mind that aspect of it, though a lot of it also does feel like kind of just set up for future potential stories if they were to do a Final Fantasy XVI 2 or future DLCs, where we do first see Clive doing something to Joshua, seemingly using his ultimate powers on him, which again, we don't fully know exactly what's happening here. If he's reviving Joshua in this instance, it's kind of ambiguous, though he then ends up using Ultima's powers to destroy the final Mother Crystal, with us getting this final scene of Clive as he awakens on a beach. And is seemingly in his final moments as we see his hand having turned to stone, and he looks to the sky, as he did with Jill during the prologue. And again, I really just don't know how to feel about this final outcome for Clive. I feel like I would have very much wanted Clive to be able to live this happy life after the destruction of the Mother Crystal, but instead for him to be seemingly on death's door, but even then not fully even committed to that, to where for all we know he does survive this. Again, I don't think he does based on the later scenes, but it's not really this clear-cut ending that I wish we at least got a clear-cut ending for Clive's role in the story. But finally, we then cut to the hideout where Jill and Gav seem to realize that Clive didn't make it just as the woman gives birth, which again is kind of over-the-top symbolism there, though we do get this really emotional final sequence as Jill is crying and Torgal's howling as the sun rises, which obviously shows that Clive was successful in what he strived to do, though seemingly doesn't end up making it back, to where we end up also getting a post-credit scene, which ends up showing us what looks like the distant future, a future without any magic, where we see a family that ends up paralleling Clive's and Joshua's, with them playing around, seemingly in peace, now owning a book written by Joshua called Final Fantasy, which even this is a bit ambiguous, where obviously you can take it for face value and look at it as, oh, Joshua survived and end up writing this book. However, I think there's also interpretation to be had that this could be Clive that wrote this book under Joshua's name, as this was something that was mentioned earlier on in the story in a conversation between the two. And really, again, this is just fully up to interpretation. I feel like there's just so much of this ending that is not conclusive. And again, I just feel like for me personally, while I understand the purpose of ambiguous endings, I do think there are certain stories that do very well with ambiguous endings. I did not feel like Final Fantasy XVI was a story that felt like it was being set up to have an ambiguous ending. And I think because of the ambiguous ending here, I am largely kind of conflicted on what I think of the actual ending here, because I want to like it, and I feel like there are aspects of it that I do like, though I do just wish we got a bit more resolution for Clive as a character, to where even though he does go through this great arc across this story, and I do love that he succeeds in this ultimate goal. The fact that it ends up seemingly costing him his life and he doesn't get to see the dividends of that, I think are just kind of underwhelming to me. Though I would not be surprised if they end up making a sequel game to this or some DLC down the road that ends up further expanding upon this. Though as of right now, I'm largely just still very conflicted on what I really think of this ending. I think it's an ending that kind of made me feel empty afterwards. Or again, it's an ending that I never really saw as a possibility. I always came into this ending thinking initially that we were going to get this happy-go-lucky ending, but I also thought there was the possibility of Clive just outright dying. But for us to get the in-between between the two kind of leaves me in this weird spot with this game. But either way, that is the entire game of Final Fantasy XVI, a game that I still very much adored. I still think this is an incredible game from beginning to end. While I do have issues with pacing, particularly in the middle portions of the game, it's still not outright bad. And while I can understand people's criticism of this not being a true Final Fantasy game, especially from a gameplay perspective, I personally don't really have those issues. I feel like for what I personally want from a video game, Final Fantasy XVI does a lot of that, with it telling this really rich character-focused story that also has incredible world building to boot, along with having a pretty fun combat system and some of the most impressive presentation I've ever seen from any game. It really just is this perfect amalgamation of everything that I want from a video game, to where while I for sure have criticisms along the way, I still really adored a lot of what this game did, to where I'll be surprised this isn't my game of the year by the end of 2023. But with that, those are my thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI. Now down the road, I'll probably also be picking up a couple other games by the end of the year that I'll end up doing spoiler reviews for, things like Assassin's Creed Mirage, I guess, and definitely Spider-Man 2. Also, early next year, we are getting Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is probably my most anticipated game at this point, to where I'll definitely be doing a video on that. And also, if we get any DLC for this game down the road, I would not be surprised if I do a video on that as well. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.